The following is a special video presentation of the Hennepin County Library.
Hi, I'm Carol Reed. Welcome to a discussion with Regina Barreca, author of Perfect Husbands and Other Fairy Tales, Demystifying Marriage, Men, and Romance. Professor Barreca is Professor of English and Feminist Theory at the University of Connecticut. She is also the author of the book, They Used to Call Me Snow White, But I've Drifted, Women's Strategic Use of Humor, another interesting book. Welcome.
Thank you,
Regina.
Carol.
Your book is very, very interesting. I really found it very insightful. I wondered about your background, your early years, and maybe your educational years.
Well, I think that maybe mine was almost an anachronistic household. I grew up in Brooklyn, in sort of a big Italian family, and I certainly grew up playing with Barbie dolls, the biggest event in Barbie's life was marriage, right? That was the biggest thing in the Barbie fashion booklet was the wedding dress. She didn't even need, like, Ken. I mean, Ken was like an accessory, you know. What she needed was like a wedding dress and girlfriends, and I thought that that's what you needed in life. I thought it was a wedding dress and girlfriends. And I was thinking lately that G.I. Joe has no wedding outfit, right? I mean, G.I. Joe does not have like a little tux that he gets dressed up in. I mean, we don't know anything about his sexual preference. We don't know anything about his personal life. He just has a job. G.I. Joe's job is to kill other toys. We never asked those sort of questions. But for Barbie, for all of my dresses as a little, all my dolls as a little kid, the wedding dress was the big thing. And everybody around me just assumed, of course, we would get married. And of course, we would get married young. Well, my cousins got married out of high school or in high school. And that even to sort of go to college I was the first one in my family to go to college. And that was sort of a little strange. To them, and I went to college out of state, which was sort of, they figured, well, she couldn't get into Brooklyn College, she's no good. I went to Dartmouth, and I was one of the first classes of women to be at Dartmouth, and as I say, one of the only people whose last name ended in a vowel. There were not a lot of small Italian women in Hanover when I was there. So I learned a lot, sort of coming from that it's sort of early, matrimonially focused woman's role is in the house, where the sauces are flying. I mean, you're cooking, you have 15 kids by the time you're 23, and to moving up to Hanover with a lot of other people I didn't feel at home with, and trying to figure out how does all of this stuff work. So, but it turns out, and then sort of marrying in my 20s, then divorcing in my early 30s, and it turns out that a lot of people have had, if not the same life, versions of the same life. And so I refer to my personal experience in Perfect Husbands and Other Fairy Tales because I found that in the writing of Snow White, that the stuff that people enjoyed most about the book were the things that seemed to me most eccentric about my life, but turned out to be actually representative or emblematic of a lot of other women's experiences.
Oh, that sounds interesting. So you made use of something that was so different from your family to lead you to a different spot.
Absolutely. The family still don't really know what to do with me. They sort of, I teach, 2 or 3 days a week, and they think I should waitress on the other days, because it's sort of I could do something with tips. And I said, no, it's a real job, honest. It's a real, even if it's 3 days a week, it's a real job. So, for them, when Snow White got reviewed in People magazine, that was like my relatives, that was like the biggest day for them. And I had all this I have 5 academic books out. I mean, nobody reads them, but they're 5 academic books. And for them, though, the People magazine, that validated everything I did. So
made it real.
Yeah, that was fine.
Well, what led you to the subject of men and women and marriage for your second book?
In part because of my second husband. I was trying to figure out when I got divorced, and there I was in my early 30s, and it seemed odd to me that people would come up who you don't know well, and they would ask you things like, why isn't somebody like you married? Now these are not people like, there's not my family, I expected it from my family, but from other people, why, and I'm trying to figure out what someone like you means. Walking upright? I mean, what is, what is like you? Wasn't really, I didn't understand what that meant. And at first I would use Liz Winstead as a funny comic, and she had a great line that said, I think, therefore I'm single. And I thought that was pretty good. But then after a while I started looking at people, and I said, well, I'll tell you why I'm single if you tell me why you're married. And they would sort of stutter and be a little abashed, because while they felt perfectly comfortable asking me that question, they seemed to me not to have considered the reasons that they were married, like maybe in a while or something. And I thought, this is interesting. And I really never thought I'd get married again. And then I met somebody, and as I say in the book, rolled up my sleeves, and we started a relationship. And the book is about the decision to marry for a second time, which Samuel Johnson described as the triumph of hope over experience, which I think is a wonderful line. But again, I think represents, I see it as a passage a lot of people have had to make.
And that line struck me too when I was reading the book, the victory of hope over experience. I wondered if you could tell us about what that meant for you.
Well, I think that it was an interesting moment for me to try to decide why enter into an institution. Again, I mean, think about the words that we use for marriage. They're not really like happy words. This is like commitment, institution. It's like I'm committing myself to an institution. It doesn't make it sound like such a thrill to get married. It sort of sounds like you're checking yourself in for the
legal
duration.
commitment.
Yeah, exactly. It's really sort of scary. And it's also, I mean, it's easier to get a marriage license than a driver's license. It seems to me we should have like learner's permits, you know, for weddings. I mean, or do the emotional equivalent of parallel parking or something so that, you know, and it is interesting too that it's so easy to get married. I mean, in that you just sign up for 3 days and do a couple of blood tests and they'll let you get married, and it's so hard to get divorced. Where suddenly the state steps in and you're in front of judges and you're in front of everything else. So the dynamics of marriage, I think, were really sort of, the political dynamics of marriage were interesting in the way they inform our personal lives. And then in my own work as an English professor, I was teaching classes in sex, politics, and marriage and literature. And those were great because you got well, you're also a teacher. I mean, you get these, you know, people sitting in a room. You have 30 people you don't really know in a room, but you're talking about ideas. You know, what an incredible privilege to be able to do that. And so we're reading Tessa the D'Urbervilles, we're reading, you know, Great Expectations or whatever we're going through. But I remember teaching Tess so well because, as you remember, Tess is, you know, this woman who gets raped, essentially, has a child, the child dies, that she marries somebody else who thinks that she's this sort of virginal, dairy-maid, you know, provincial girl. And at some point then we started talking about virginity in the class, and one of the young women from the back of the room said, isn't it nice that at least virginity isn't the sort of commodity anything, you know, for women anymore, that men aren't out there looking for virgins, it's not something you have to prove. And I had a young man sitting in the front row who I'd had in class before, and I had to say, I mean, perhaps it was unkind, but I turned to him and I said, you know, Bob, just, you know, tell me the truth. Like, if you could marry a virgin, would you marry a virgin? And he like paused and said, you know, it's like he had the bunny in the headlights look, like he thought, oh, what? And I said, well, you want to know the truth? Yeah, sure, I would marry a virgin if I could. And then like one of the other women from the back of the class said, that's not what you guys tell us on the weekends. You know, when you come to the dorms, this isn't what you say, oh, I'd like to marry a virgin. So we started to talk about whether virginity was in fact still a commodity, whether guys' expectations were such, and how, you know, was there any woman who wanted to marry a virgin? This was never like, you know, again, a woman's fantasy. So the classroom led to really interesting discussions, and Perfect Husbands deals with a lot of literature as well as sort of pop culture and real life situations, quote unquote real life situations.
Oh, that's true, and that's, you know, what people say and what people actually feel. Very, very different, and the expectation of what you need to say to be accepted, and what you really feel. Very interesting class. You talk about politics, and I think that's an interesting word as far as relationships and marriage are concerned. I wondered if you felt that there were differences between the politics of a relationship, coming to the dorm on the weekends, maybe, something like that, and the politics of marriage.
Absolutely. I think that essentially there really is always a difference between courtship and marriage. And one of the things, like when I was on the Donahue show a couple of weeks ago, and there was a woman who called in who said, I just broke up with my fiance last night because he said, are you going to get fat after we get married? I want you to promise me you're not going to get fat after we get married. I said, do you think I was right to break up with him? I said, look, if this guy is saying this stuff to you during the courtship period, when people are really supposed to be on their best behavior, then yeah, I really think it was probably wise. You know, I mean, I said, because what's he going to say to you after you get married? And the guy sitting next to me said, why did you get fat? Which I thought was, you know, but it just seemed like an odd thing for her to have to write this guarantee for this to happen, that during courtship we really do present versions of ourselves, and especially young women are still encouraged to be disingenuous, right? That every magazine article says, laugh at his jokes even if you don't find them funny. Pretend you like sports even when you don't. Develop an interest in those things. That it was like those pictures of Lady Diana fly fishing with Charles when they were going out. You know, that somehow you're supposed to fake it until you actually marry the poor man. And then it's like, well, you turn that off. You know, I don't want to go to that stupid game. And guys are going, what did I do? What did I do? I married you thinking that you like to do this. And she said, well, but they told me I was supposed to do this in magazines until we get married. And they don't tell me I have to keep doing it afterwards. And I think that that sort of instruction and disingenuousness is harmful to everybody, that women should not have to false advertise ourselves. It's like, if you don't like the Three Stooges, you don't like the Three Stooges. And you should not like fake liking the Three Stooges, you know? I mean, it's really a violation of the self to have to laugh along with Larry, Moe, and Curly if you don't really find them funny, and not a whole lot of women do. And I think that often men marry women thinking that they won't change, and women marry men thinking that they will.
And interesting, insightful. I did, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yes, the expectation is there that that will happen.
Right, exactly. That women are sitting there going, well, it's like a dress. It's like, I can tailor him. Just that, you know, okay, he does this now, but he won't do that after we're married. If he does it now, he's probably going to do it after you're married.
Yeah, you can't make him into the husband that you want.
Right, absolutely.
So, or keep, conversely, a man can't keep a woman the way.
Right, she was.
Yeah,
right.
although it's a bigger surprise. But, and you talk about that too, where women are much more into that the focus, excuse me, of women's lives are, well, they view marriage as a destination rather than a journey. And I thought that was a very interesting thing. You know, the goal of a woman's life is to marry, and in your book you discuss the ways in which a man tries to avoid ensnarement for as long as they can. What would you recommend that, and you also say that by women viewing men as not as commodities, but as fallible human beings and not as husband material, how would you recommend for women to really to actualize that?
Yeah, I think the first thing is to realize again how much we're encouraged to do it by the culture. That it's not just us. A lot of the times we feel like we're blowing it, or we're disappointing, or we're disappointed. What did I do wrong that I don't have this great Donna Reed? How come I'm not wearing pearls before 8 in the morning? You know, how come I'm not coming down fully coiffed and making a 14-course breakfast? And you know, we got to drop these old scripts. Or I talk in the book about the way that pop songs. I grew up listening to all of this stuff on the radio, where you know girls are singing along to "Tell Him." Remember, "Tell Him" was like, "Tell him that you're never going to leave him. Tell him that you're always going to love him. Tell him, tell him, tell him, tell him right now." And that's like the worst advice ever given to women ever. Because if you tell him, he's going to leave like skid marks, right? I mean, he's going to, you know, and that, I mean, the woman is this sort of beast of prey, you know, is really sort of, I mean, that she's going to go after him and she's going to get him in her clutches and all of these things.
Snare him,
yeah,
yes.
Exactly, the ensnarement, the ball and chain idea, that somehow, you know, it's women who are always after the man, or she's going to catch him. Right, she's going to catch the guy. Interesting dynamics, especially given, and this is again the cliche certainly, but studies that have recently come out of the Center for Marital and Family Therapy in Washington show that the two happiest groups are married men and single women. That, you know, which is an interesting, it was in USA Today, they sort of asked me to comment on it, and it really was sort of curious because, again, men I think have fewer expectations for marriage, so they're quite happy about it. But as you said, since it's been for so many girls this idea of being raised to think this is like the biggest day of their lives, then they want to know how come they're not transformed by it. How come everything doesn't get better? How come you end up being who you were to start off with? In a traditional ceremony, you have marriage making, it says, you know, we now pronounce you man and wife. Presumably he started out as a man, otherwise you wouldn't have married him. So he doesn't really change, but the woman changes from the woman into the wife. And what does that mean? And for a lot of times that she's feeling as if, again, she's going to be, it's going to make straw into gold. It's some kind of alchemy, and it doesn't work that way.
You talk about in the book about marriage and men's expectation that when you were in college you were very independent, fiercely independent, and the men that you saw, the young men that you saw, were very much appreciated that. But when they came to marry, that wasn't the kind of woman that they married.
Right. Exactly. Everybody wants a wife. I mean, I can understand it better now than I did it at 22. And I was going, we were all committed to the idea of rejecting marriage. We were all committed, you know, we'd put those toys away and we weren't going to do that anymore. And then suddenly at 22, these guys were marrying these like nice, you know, brownie baking, you know, shy, quiet, demure women who said, I'll do whatever you want. And I was resentful, because I thought, wait, we again had all pledged ourselves to this camaraderie of independence. And then I really did start to think, well, I mean, if if a wife, if you want to take the word wife, which the signify, and if what it means is someone who's going to make you the center of their emotional life, who's going to raise beautiful children who look like you but who will be quiet when you need to work, you know, someone who will cook all your meals, make your favorite foods, write notes to your relatives, who wouldn't want that? I would love that. That would be great. It seems to me that's what we all need, but the world doesn't allow even the people who would choose to do that much anymore, because there are very few families that are not two-paycheck households. The privilege, even for those who would choose it, of assuming that role can hardly be open to that many people anymore. We've got to change. There's a 30-year lag time between our expectations for marriage and our images of marriage and how our lives actually function, I think.
Speak more about that, about expectations. I think that what we've been talking about in part has been the unrealistic expectations, that men's unrealistic expectations of something terrible turn out to be something pleasant. For women, something pleasant turns out to be not so great. How would you, what should we expect? What should we change our expectations to?
I think that the expectations are, first of all, that marriage, again, will exacerbate whatever state you're in. So that if you're happy, you may be happier, but if you're unhappy, you're probably going to be unhappier. It's not going to make you from unhappy into happy. That, going back to the sort of pop song stuff, that going to the chapel and we're going to get married is fine, but then the line, and I'll never be lonely anymore, doesn't work. No matter how good a relationship is, there are going to be moments when you feel isolated, when you feel lonely, when you feel like you look at somebody across the table and you say, how did I end up with this person, you know? And he or she might well be looking back going, how did I end up with this person? And it's like, first of all, both of you are not doing it at the same time is probably good. And if you are doing it at the same time, and at least you can maybe step back and laugh, I believe in the power of humor, because it offers some perspective, or it comes out of some kind of perspective. When we find ourselves reiterating the old scripts, when you have those arguments that your parents used to have that you promised yourself you would never have, right? All of those words that come out of your mouth and suddenly they're like in your mother's voice or your aunt's voice or your second grade teacher's voice. And like if you can stop yourself and say, wait a minute, I'm sorry, this really, you know, we really don't need to argue about this. We don't need to argue about, if you have a 4-hour argument about whether the fact is that somebody leaves a pencil next to the answering machine or not to write down the messages, you know, marriages break up over things like that, but they don't really break up about things like that. They break up about larger issues of control and power. And I think that we need to, unromantically perhaps, examine those issues and say, this is a relationship where all this stuff comes into play. And we need to figure out what the real dynamic is underneath something and not waste our time arguing about the details when there's really a lot more substantial stuff that we need to work out.
The issues are still there to be looked at. You mentioned the word romance and also demystifying romance in your book. Romance is such a wonderful word. It has a lot of meanings for everyone. How can we realistically change our view of romance?
Well, there's a line in the book that I think I might have stolen from a country song, but it's something along the lines of romance writes checks that reality can't cash. You know, I mean, it should be a country song. If it isn't, I can't even remember. But the idea is that we're set up to think. That's why, like, a lot of men hate to go see relationship movies with women, because at some point we like elbow them in the ribs and we say, "How come you don't say things like that? How come you're not romantic? How come you don't fill the room with a dozen red roses?" You know, I mean, that guys are going like, "I'm going to go see movies like Demolition Man, because then no one will say, how come you're not doing this?" You know, we think that somehow those things that apply in texts, whether they're novels, movies, whatever, can apply in real life, and they can't. A text is a limited, finite, constructed object. You know, there are no happy endings in life as long as you're alive, because you can't have a happy ending in the middle. You keep going, right? Yes. Exactly. I mean, life changes, and therefore you're going to change. The relationship is going to change. Within any marriage, there are many marriages. I mean, it's the best marriages are going to be able to sort of alter themselves as the people inside them change, and not be this static sort of, you know, image that you sort of can't go out of the frame of, like some sort of cartoon version of what a relationship is supposed to be. And I think that we should better bring our children up, or our students, to think that marriage is not going to be something. One of my students said, "I really want to get married so I can stop thinking about relationships." I said, "No, believe me, that's not how it works. This is, you don't get married to stop thinking about relationships. This is very hard work. This is not going to make your life easier. This is not going to make your life simpler. It can bring you great joy. It can give you enormous pleasure. I think marriage is a viable institution, but I think people aren't aware of the fact that there's so much work involved. I mean, you are once you're inside of it, but a lot of people feel like if you have to work on it, then it's not true love, and that's a real misconception, I think.
Yes, the perfect love. If there are arguments, if there are disagreements, misunderstandings, then somehow somebody's not doing something.
Right, and then you might just simply, you might have a perfectly good partner in front of you, but you might be turning and saying, well, this one will be better because this person will make me happy, and not realize that it's nobody's business to make you happy, and that it's not even possible. You can't make someone happy. You can be there to share their joy, you can encourage them, you can support them, but it's like nobody's job description to make somebody happy. And I think that too often we look to our partners to do that, and it's an impossible task.
A major myth of marriage is that they will make you happy.
Right.
Or somehow you can make yourself happy with them around.
Right, and that I think is, I mean, at least if there's some understanding that it's our own responsibility to do it, I think that's okay, but to sort of be expecting somebody to sort of prop you up all the time, or that you were always going to gooily and dually sort of, gush over somebody, instead of, again, getting on with the hard work of lining up next to each other and proceeding through the world. You can't always look in each other's eyes, you're going to fall down. I mean, at a certain point, you have to turn from one another and look at the world around you and sort of maybe go through it hand in hand, but you don't want this sort of tunnel vision that has you only gazing into each other's eyes, because the world offers this great stuff out there, and it's good to look at it together, but you have to, look around to be able to do it.
And you talk about taking responsibility for yourself as women within the context of marriage. And I wondered what kind of advice you would give to young, like teenage girls who are really vulnerable to what we were talking about earlier, the songs, socialization, magazines, everything.
Right. I think the first thing is to realize that somebody who's trying to sell you something is not giving you good advice for no reason, right? So that, I buy all those little makeup things thinking that, we live for, I read every magazine article in a women's magazine about trying to figure out what shape your face is to get the right haircut. We keep thinking that if we only get this one thing right, everything else in our lives will fall into place. And that's simply not true. The seduction of that idea is enormous, is absolutely enormous. And even in examining it for the last 20 years, it still has this sort of pull. It's a really basic sort of desire to think that now everything will be okay if I do this one thing, if blondes have more fun, whatever it happens to be, that I'm going to make this change for myself and then everything will be fine. So I think always being on your guard for who's giving you what advice and why. Qui bono, who profits? Why is somebody who's telling you something, why are they telling you something? That's sort of the first thing. And I think the other thing is to realize again that a lot of my students will come up and say, Dr. Barreca, I'd like to follow your advice, but if I do, will I ever get a date? And I say, well, look, finally, you'll just get dates with guys that you might actually like and who'll like you for who you are. You can skip those dates with the guys who you need to set like fire to the tablecloth for something interesting to happen. You'll skip the dates with people that you won't actually want to spend time with. You'll be with somebody who wants you for you, and it seems to me that that's just a shortcut as opposed to having to go through all of these different layers of, again, sort of tissues of dishonesty that we're taught are supposed to really be feminine.
And critical. And also that it sounds to me also that what's in magazines, what's in songs are women's translations of what they feel men want. So they translate all of that into men's view. If they change their hair, that's what men want.
Right.
So
and they're not aware that men are not noticing this, right?
Yeah, it's just the magazine.
Yeah, exactly. But we still have things like in not only young girls' magazines, but in women's magazines, very expensive ads for something like the Estee Lauder perfume Beautiful, which has a toupee, it's like the centerfold, in L or something. And it will have Paulina, whatever her name is, that $1 billion model. And she's wearing a wedding dress, and the copy reads, "Today is your day to be beautiful." Now that's a current ad. What's the implication there? That you're going to spend the rest of your life smelling bad with your head in a paper bag. That this is like the last important day you're going to have. And that's a current ad for presumably mature readers. So we're still buying into this. I think the other thing is to realize that I really don't think we are in a post-feminist era. I think that there is a lot of work to do, and maybe we're on a new sort of wave of feminism. I'd like to think that's also very men-friendly. you know, that's looking at the constriction of masculinity as much as the constriction of femininity. That guys, I mean, I interviewed hundreds of men for Perfect Husbands and Other Fairy Tales, and they felt very, where are all these privileges? You know, what's my privilege? I get to work a menial job where I'm going to get laid off and die 15 years before my wife of a stress-related heart attack. I don't feel like I'm in such a privileged position. So the book examines marriage from their point of view as well. I really try to sort of quilt together a lot of the ways that, again, what people's lives are actually like versus what somehow they think they should be like, and the ways that we can make those things sort of come together, where we can close the gap, and so, again, allow ourselves maybe the possibility of happiness.
And I was curious too about who you used as resources. You mentioned that you had a lot of personal interviews with people, and what was
promises of anonymity, and actually I got to say a lot of good Chivas Regal it's really late night conversations, not to encourage drinking, but I got friends of friends. I had men that I spoke to over the phone who, I mean, I'm not a journalist, I'm an English professor, so I sort of, again, it's anecdotal. But what was interesting is there were some men, some of whom I had known quite well, who were in long-term marriages, who I knew were telling me stories because they knew that I wouldn't reveal who they were, that they really should have been telling their wives. I mean, I knew their wives. And I knew that somehow it was safer to tell me of their feeling of vulnerability, of their sense of dislocation, of their fears, of their worries, that they felt it was still somehow wrong of them to tell their wives. I was thinking, knowing their wives, how grateful their wives would have been for this, and how, you know, if a man comes home, I mean, these men felt that they were being good husbands by not burdening their partners with all of this stuff. And the wives, meanwhile, are thinking, why is he so unhappy? Is he unhappy at home? Is he having an affair? Is this, is that? Torturing themselves by trying to fill in the story that they weren't getting. And in those kind of cases, each partner really believes that he or she is doing what's the best thing for the other, but they're working across purposes. And that, again, was sort of an interesting thing to realize, because both people can feel that they're working very hard and still somehow it's not taking. And that's where, again, you know, getting down to speaking honestly and without a fear of intimacy, which even in our most intimate relationships we sometimes have, would be the key to getting stuff right.
Now you talk about marriage as a partnership. How would your view of a new partnership as a marriage include that? How would that kind of repair some of this expectation that we have that to be silent, to wonder why they're silent?
Well, I think that the idea of the partnership is important, that you want somebody who's a match for you. You want somebody who's a match intellectually, who's a match emotionally. Sometimes people, you know, sometimes opposites can attract, and that can work out. Somebody could be very gregarious and the other person could be very shy. But I think that the ones that people I've spoken to that seem to work well is when they know that somebody gets it. I mean, you can look across that dinner table where somebody's saying something absolutely absurd, and you can catch the eye of your partner, and you know that they're thinking, you know, they get why this is absurd, or they get why this is funny. And even if you can't, you know, act it out in any way, you know that somebody's sort of with you for that moment. And I think that it's hard to have an equal partnership in a world where women are treated unequally from men. If you're making 68 cents on a man's dollar, it's tough to sort of get that stuff straight. I know men and women alike sometimes stay in relationships for financial reasons, that they feel trapped by this stuff. They're afraid to go to work. They're afraid, men are afraid to leave their wives because they're afraid that their wives will never make it financially. You know, they feel very guilty about it. You know, I think we literally have to take political action to get stuff straightened out outside our homes, as well as to try to get stuff inside our homes.
This has been very, very interesting. I heartily recommend the book, Perfect Husbands and Other Fairy Tales by Regina Barreca. And it's been very enjoyable talking with you. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Carol. It was terrific.
A presentation of the Hennepin County Library.